It's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is eavesdrop. And this is another verb that has been suggested by the viewer Luis, so a special thank you. I love hearing people's ideas for verbs to talk about. But now let's take a moment and review how do we use this verb. The verb eavesdrop really only has one meaning, and that is to secretly listen to a conversation. Okay? So again, I would say the emphasis here, secretly. So if someone is including you or inviting you to participate into a conversation, you're not eavesdropping. But if you're trying to listen and hear what others are saying without them noticing, you are eavesdropping. Now, for now, we should all know that eavesdrop is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, we are going to double the ending P because our verb ends in that consonant vowel consonant pattern. Okay? And we do that before we add ing. The progressive form of our verb is pronounced eavesdropping. Eavesdropping. Okay. The past tense and the participle forms of our verb can be made in a similar way. We're going to double the ending P and then add ed. Our base verb, eavesdrop, ends in an unvoiced sound. P sounds are unvoiced. And this means our ed ending is going to make a T sound. Okay. We're not going to add an extra syllable when we say it. So the past tense and the participle forms of our verb should sound like this. Eavesdropped, eavesdropped. Okay. Now, you will encounter a phrasal verb. It doesn't really change our meaning here, but I thought still good for us to look at and practice. You might notice people use eavesdrop on. So again, someone is intentionally trying to listen to some conversation where they are not participating. Okay, they're not a participant in that conversation. So, an example of how you might hear this. Is she eavesdropping on us? Right? So maybe we notice someone and we kind of wonder, is she trying to secretly listen to our conversation without us noticing? Now, let's continue using our verb of the day, and we'll review a couple verb tenses as we do this. Today, I thought it would be good to review the past progressive and the simple past tense. We'll start with the past progressive. Many teachers, textbooks, and other YouTube videos will call this the past continuous, and that's just fine. It means exactly the same thing. So in the past progressive or the past continuous, we're talking about an action that was in progress during some completed point in time or an ongoing time period. Okay? The reason I like saying past progressive with my students is I hope that it can help them remember we need two P's or two parts to our verb. Okay? So in the past progressive, we're going to be using a past form of be and the ing form of the verb. And our be verb is very unique. It's always got something a little special about it. We actually have two forms of be in the past tense. So this is one where we need to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, he, she, or it, we'll use was and then that ing form of the verb. But if our subject is you, we, or they, we're going to use were. W-E-R-E, and then that ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example. He was eavesdropping on his wife's business calls, and then he was sued for insider trading. As I looked for examples of this verb, I actually noticed there were many instances where this has happened in various countries where, interestingly enough, it was a lot of men listening to their wives working, or in one case, I think it was a fiance, right? Kind of listening in on what was going to be happening and then making trades with this special information that was not publicly available in order to make a lot of money. So can't do that here in the United States or in many other countries. It is a crime. And so that past progressive here describes that the action was continuing or it was ongoing. Okay? So now let's take a look at making a negative past progressive sentence. To do this, again, we start with our subject. We use either was not or were not, depends on what our subject is, and then we use the ing form of the verb. Sometimes was not will be combined into the contraction wasn't, and were not can be combined into the contraction weren't. Here's another example. I wasn't eavesdropping for very long, right? That might be someone's defense, what they say, like, I was listening, but not very long. I didn't hear anything. Okay. Finally, let's talk about making a yes or no question in the past progressive. To do this, you start with either was or were, whichever form matches your subject, that subject comes next, and then use the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Were you eavesdropping while your parents were arguing? Right? So might be something we generally try and teach children not to try and secretly listen to adults' conversations. But here, right, someone is asking kind of yes or no, was that action ongoing? Now let's move on and talk about sentences in the simple past tense. Okay? What makes the simple past tense a little different than our past progressive is that we are really focused that this action is completed. Okay? Many times we're using the the simple past tense to talk about completed actions at a known point in the past. Okay? The nice thing about sentences in the simple past tense is that our structure is going to stay the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, you're going to see a subject, and then you're going to see the ed form the verb. An example of this. The U.S. eavesdropped on the private conversations of the UN Secretary General and other officials. Okay? So here we're talking about a completed action. I know my sentence doesn't have a time signal here, but it was part of a longer story, and so there would have been a specific time in mind from this particular writer. Now let's look at making negative simple past tense sentences. To do this, we start with our subject, we use did not, then we use the base verb. So notice, we're not using the ed form of our verb in the negative. Here's another example. They didn't eavesdrop to be malicious, right? So they weren't trying to maybe get secret information, do something bad with that information, but it does seem to acknowledge here they were listening secretly. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question. To do this, we start with did, then we're going to have our subject, and then the base verb. Something I always like pointing out to my students, notice the only time I'm using the ed form of my verb is in the affirmative. I am not using it in my negative statements or in yes or no questions. Let's look at that final example. Did prosecutors eavesdrop on the defendant's phone calls with his defense attorneys, right? This is also likely something that is kind of a no-no, not appropriate at all for attorneys who are responsible for arguing the government's case against someone to have listened in secretly on that person's communications with his attorneys. Now, let's take a moment and talk about some words related to our verb eavesdrop. The first word we're going to talk about today is the noun, eavesdropper. This is a person who listens to a private conversation without another person or other people's knowledge. An example of this might be, our youngest is the biggest eavesdropper. We wait until we know he is asleep before we have any private conversations. I had a coworker say something rather similar to this recently. Their youngest child is someone who I think is pretty sneaky. They don't know, but knows he's listening to everything happening in the house. So They've learned an important lesson there. Okay. Thank you so much for this idea, Louise. Thank you all for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.